Hello, Irvine. From Microbe TV, this is TWIV, This Week in Virology, episode 496, recorded on May 14th, 2018. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you are listening to the podcast all about viruses. We are recording today at Vaccines in the 21st Century, Overcoming Viruses and Misinformation, a meeting being held at the University of California, Irvine. And joining me today, a regular TWIV host, Rich Condit.
Hello, Vincent. On the road again.
It's always fun
Yep.
to be on the road. Also joining us, we have three of the speakers from this meeting. First, from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, making her second appearance on TWIV, Stacy Schultz-Cherry. Welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Thank you. And then we have two first-time visitors to TWIV from the University of Washington, Douglas Diekema. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And from the University of California, Irvine, right here, homegrown, Andrew Noymer. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. These three individuals all talked about viral vaccines of some sort. That's the focus of this meeting. And we're going to ask them some questions today. For you in the audience, some of them might be repetitive, but remember, this is going out to billions of people. Well, maybe not billions, but
Could be if they all tuned in.
they did. Now, before we start, Rich, is today a special day of some sort?
Today is a special day for two reasons. First of all, it wouldn't be TWIV without the weather. It's 66 degrees and sunny outside here in Southern California. So got to get that out of the way.
All right, weather. It's kind of cold, isn't it?
Well, depending on your perspective. Very pleasant for me. So yes, today is a special day. Ironically, appropriately, today is smallpox vaccination day. On this day, May 14th in 1796, this was the day that Edward Jenner inoculated James Phipps with the cowpox virus to test whether or not it conferred immunity to smallpox. So, and that was, of course, enormously successful and ultimately led to the eradication of the disease. So I think that's a nice irony for this conference.
Did you plan this, Bert?
I did.
Of course. It's the right answer you've learned.
And that was 222 years ago. That's got to be some sort of weird number, right?
Well, and Sid was just a child then.
Yeah, right.
222. That's pretty good. All right. Now we're going to start with the basics here because we want people to take this episode, and if someone asks you, how can I learn about vaccines, you can give it to them. So we'll start simple and we'll get more and more complicated. So let me start first with Stacy. What are vaccines?
So vaccines are injecting antigens, parts of a microbe. It could be a toxin, it could be a protein, it could be a carbohydrate. Injecting them, intranasally administering them into your body so that you build immunity to them. Typically, it's B cell or antibody responses. Often it can also be T cell responses. And what you want to do is have your body develop memory to these so that when they see the actual infection, they're able to respond very quickly to prevent disease.
And I guess a key part is not to actually cause disease, right?
Absolutely. So they have to be safe, and you don't want to cause the disease that you're trying to prevent.
Right. Okay. All right. Why do we still need vaccines?
Because the diseases are still around.
Really? They haven't gone away because of vaccination?
Other than smallpox, no, they haven't, because many parts of the world and even within the U.S. there are people that choose not to be vaccinated. But in developing countries, there may not be vaccine available.
So I find an interesting irony here from your description. If you look up the definition of homeopathy, homeopathy is a claim made in 1796, same year, that a substance that causes the symptoms of a disease in healthy people would cure similar symptoms in sick people. Okay? So I think vaccines are probably the only successful application of homeopathy in the known universe. So work that on your friends. Doug, can you give me some idea of how we know that vaccines actually work? What's the evidence?
Well, I'm less familiar with the lab evidence, which I'm sure Stacey can fill you in on, but clinically and epidemiologically, there's just compelling data that they do. Almost every time a vaccine is introduced, within a year or two, you see dramatic drops in incidence.
Is there, when a vaccine is developed, there's extensive testing done, is that right?
That's
and
absolutely correct.
how's that actually done?
Well, it starts in the lab, it moves to animals, and only when it's been proven safe and efficacious in animals does it move to humans. Usually we start with adults and humans and move to children.
You gave actually a very personal experience as a pediatrician with your own experience of your own evidence of how vaccines work. Maybe you could relate that to us.
Yeah, I mean, I've now lived through really the introduction of 2 vaccines for relatively common illnesses, Haemophilus influenza B and chickenpox. And to me, the more dramatic one was Haemophilus influenza B because that was just a devastating illness for children. We saw children die from that. We saw children with disabilities who survived. And as a resident taking care of these kids, it was probably the disease we most feared because these kids would come in so sick and you would be battling to first diagnose them and then save their lives. And I would say I saw at least one case every couple weeks during my residency in one way, shape, or form. And I got to my fellowship in Seattle, and the last case I saw was about 25 years ago, and that was a child with epiglottitis who I went off on an airlift to retrieve from our local naval base. And one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, trying to keep that child alive on the helicopter until we got back to Seattle. And I have not seen a case since.
Would you say that the increase in the number of years we live now compared to, say, the early 1900s is in part due to vaccines?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, if you look in the early 1900s, infectious diseases were really the big killer, and we've eliminated those for the most part as a cause of death, and vaccines are a huge part of that.
Okay.
Can I jump in there? Or?
Yeah, you can,
Yeah.
sure.
The measles death-to-case ratio in the 1920s in the United States was about 1/2 of 1%. And every child got measles. So they typically got it around age 4. And so some of them had died from other causes of infant mortality. So you wouldn't be correct to say that 1/2 of 1% of every child born died of measles back then, but a very significant number of children died of measles back then. Over 10,000 measles deaths per year back then in the US. So it was a major, the decline of these infectious diseases, of which vaccines played a major role, is a major contributor to longer life.
In fact, you said today that with measles, everyone gets infected.
Essentially, everyone gets infected with measles. I mean, during the First World War, rural recruits to U.S. Army training bases got measles because for the first time in their life, they were in a metropolitan environment. So you could live to an older age without getting measles if you lived out in a rural area. But for kids growing up in cities, I mean, everyone gets measles. I mean,
I got measles as a kid. Who here got measles as a kid?
Yeah.
I got it from the vaccine.
You got it from the vaccine. Wow, we'll have to come back to that. All right, let's continue with Andrew. How do we test vaccines for safety?
well, there's a sort of 4-tiered system. There's phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and then there's pharmacovigilance after a vaccine is approved. So the phase 1 trial is safety. So can this vaccine be administered safely? Phase 2 is immunogenicity. Does the vaccine generate an immune response? And the third phase is efficacy. Does the vaccine protect against the disease? Now, the safety aspects never goes away. I mean, phase 1 is a safety trial, but we continue to evaluate vaccine safety in phase 2 and phase 3. And we continue to evaluate the immunogenicity in phase 3. It's just that we ramp it up. And then phase 4 is pharmacovigilance, where we continue to monitor with a much larger sample size once the vaccine is approved. And the Rota shield would be an example of that.
So how does that work? The you call pharmacovigilance. How does that work?
Basically, the phase 1 trials are very small sample size. It's just to make sure that the vaccine can be administered safely. Phase 2 trials are larger sample size, and phase 3 trials are larger sample size. But when a vaccine is deployed, we have all of a sudden sample sizes of hundreds of thousands of people who have been administered the vaccine. So we can monitor for rare adverse events much more effectively than we can even in a phase 3 trial. So basically, we never stop looking for problems or trying to improve vaccines. Another
adverse effects reported in some system?
Yeah, reported by, I mean, if it would be for a childhood vaccine, typically reported by pediatricians.
And so is this part of the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System?
That's right.
So is that a good way to tell if there is a problem with any vaccine?
Well, I mean, it's pretty unusual for vaccines to be withdrawn from the market. So these are rare occurrences, but yeah, that's, I mean, for rare events, by definition, you need a large sample size to see them. And, you know, we can't do a phase 3 trial on a million kids, say. I mean, typically that would be not warranted by the sample size calculations required to show the efficacy. And so, so you have an opportunity once the vaccine is licensed to have a much larger sample size. Yeah. I mean, we've switched up the pertussis vaccine because the former one, which actually protected better, had a higher incidence of adverse reactions than we considered acceptable.
So of all the current vaccines used, are there any safety issues that have been revealed by these reporting systems?
Well, there was a vaccine against rotavirus that causes diarrhea in children. And one of the rotavirus vaccines was withdrawn from the market because it causes, it was linked to intussusception, which is where you get a collapse of the intestine. It sort of collapses on itself like a sleeve or like a folding telescope. So that vaccine was withdrawn from the market. I mentioned in my talk the high titer Edmondson Zagreb measles vaccine, which in the early 90s was being used in developing countries. And the issue there is that it's really tricky to know when to give the measles vaccine by age of the child, because infants have maternal antibody that prevents the vaccine from working. So ideally, you would just wait. But if you wait too long, it defeats the purpose. They get measles. So what you really want is a vaccine that can sort of punch through the maternal antibody and immunize the child in spite of the presence of the maternal antibody. So they developed a high titer vaccine that did that. And it worked. The problem was it mimicked natural measles infection a little too well. And even though it protected against measles, we still saw this 3-month period of immunosuppression after the administration of the vaccine that I spoke about in the conference, in which there was higher all-cause mortality. So that vaccine was withdrawn by the WHO as a result of these long-term monitoring. There were studies done in Senegal and Haiti on this problem. And so that would be another example where they changed course.
So that's interesting. These are several cases of long-term monitoring on a large population scale that is beneficial in the long run in identifying issues with vaccines. So, Stacey, you had a slide where you showed a whole lot of vaccines that are currently recommended for children. Do you know what that number is? How many are
Is
recommended?
it 14?
14?
looking
I
at
want to say
Douglas.
17. It's,
Yeah, that was my first thought.
Yeah.
It's
So how do those recommendations come about? How is it decide? Who decides, and how is it decided what's going to be recommended?
I think it's the American Academy of Pediatrics, correct? Or the
well, and it's ACIP as well. Then what is that? The
American Council
of Immunization Practices.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's several different, especially for childhood, there's several different groups that make recommendations on what the childhood vaccines should be, and then recommend them to the countries.
So why can't individuals just decide for themselves?
What would you choose, Rich?
I might choose to have none, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So-
And I think it's based on best medical practice, what we're seeing circulating within the population, because the recommendations may differ for different countries. So I think it's dependent on the public health and what's best for at the country level.
So one of the issues is going to be, I would assume, for recommending vaccines is not only for protection of individuals, but to get reasonable vaccine coverage. Could you explain why it is that coverage is important?
Right. So we need to get population or herd immunity. So we need to get enough people vaccinated or protected in some way so that if this disease does emerge, you don't have an outbreak of some kind. And that is critically important because there are populations that can't get vaccinated. So like the children that are at St. Jude who are immunocompromised, they can't be vaccinated. And there are other children and adults with underlying immune complications that you can't vaccinate. So you have to make sure that you can protect them through herd immunity. And we know that there's also waning immunity. If you look at aged adults, we can vaccinate them, it may not be as good. So again, that's where herd immunity is absolutely critical for protecting at a population level.
And how are we doing in the U.S. population-wise?
I think it depends on the vaccine.
Was it you, Doug, who had maps of that?
Yes, to some degree, but it does depend on the vaccine. Measles is probably the one that spreads the most easily, so
Yes.
the level of population coverage required to really create herd immunity for measles is over 90%, somewhere between 92 and 95. It's less so for a disease like Haemophilus influenza B, which doesn't spread as easily between people.
Seems to me this is an opportunity in tracking coverage and tracking disease to get some idea of what appropriate herd immunity is and whether or not there's really a correlation. And is that sort of tracking done so you can get some idea as to what an appropriate level of coverage is, and if you don't have it, you're going to increase the risk of disease?
I think the tracking it in real time is pretty variable. I think some states' departments of health do it better than others. What does happen, though, is when you get disease outbreaks like a measles outbreak or a pertussis outbreak, usually either the Center for Disease Control or the state health departments will investigate those, and often part of that is to determine what the levels of herd immunity were within the community that the outbreak occurred.
Okay.
So in terms of just raw vaccine coverage, how well do we do in the U.S.? Do you have some number? Do we go over 90%, over 95%?
I think, again, it depends on the vaccine.
What's the best vaccine? I know it's not flu. Right?
It's not, no, not right now, it's not flu. Probably MMR.
We do quite well with MMR.
Yeah.
I mean, most states are over 90%. Oregon is the poorest performing state on that. But most states are above 90% in MMR.
Okay. So, you just talked about herd immunity a bit. I have a story. I was having a conversation with a physician, and she expressed the view that she gave her parents, her patients, the choice of whether to be vaccinated. And I said, well, you can't give a choice. It's not how it works. And she said, are you talking about herd immunity? And I said, yes, you have to have a certain fraction of people. She said, well, that's never been proven to work. At that point, I just left. But what should I have said? What would have been what's the proof that herd immunity works? Can anyone say that?
Well, I mean, as a first step, we see these so-called post-honeymoon measles outbreaks. So in country after country, when you introduce measles vaccination, measles incidence goes way down. And then what happens is, a few years later, you get an outbreak. So Akron, Ohio, 1970. Developing countries, Burundi, 1989. Huge after-the-fact measles outbreaks. And what that is you introduce vaccination, and so it's like throwing a wet blanket on a fire. It keeps the flames down. But if you're not achieving 92% coverage, then you're slowly accumulating more and more susceptibles until they cross the epidemic threshold, which is sort of the opposite of the herd immunity threshold, and you get a large outbreak. And we see in these outbreaks that the cases are older. Why? Because over time they've accumulated, and every year that goes by, they get a year older. And so it's clearly the kids who have missed the rollout of the vaccine who are the fuel for the fire of this post-honeymoon, as it's called, outbreak. And it's herd immunity in action, basically.
Okay. All right, Douglas, why is it that some people fear or distrust vaccination?
There are many reasons, actually, and one of the things I encourage healthcare providers to think about is actually diagnosing an individual family's reasons, because you can't really address them adequately if you don't know why this particular family is worried about vaccines. The reality is probably you have hardcore anti-vaccine people that comprise probably 1% to 2% of the population. And they're in a significant minority. And then you have about 70% of the population that really has no issues with vaccination. And then there's this 28, 29% of the population that's worried about them. They're vaccine hesitant is the term we use. They're not necessarily ideologically opposed to vaccination, but they have worries. They've heard about side effects. Many still worry about autism, despite the fact that there has been no correlation shown between autism and vaccine administration. Some families don't like the idea of injecting what they consider to be foreign material into their child. Some families are worried about overwhelming the immune system, none of which is based on sort of good science, but it doesn't keep them from reading about it on social media and being concerned about it. And that's where people get their information now. And unfortunately, on social media, the opinion of somebody who has no scientific background can, for many families, carry as much weight as the opinion of somebody who really understands how these work.
I think it was Andrew who mentioned that, or maybe it was you as well, that anti-vaxxers have been around since Jenner. But is distrust of vaccine increasing? Is it staying the same? What is?
Well, one interesting thing that just occurred to me, you mentioned the word injection. And I think that has a lot to do with it. People are shy about injections, and even the vitamin K shot, which is not a vaccine, that newborns receive.
Yeah.
And you're a pediatrician, you might have some more insight on that. But there's been a lot more hesitancy about the vitamin K shot. And also the oral polio vaccine, which we don't typically use in this country, we use the injectable. But the oral polio vaccine seems to, people sometimes say, well, they don't want the IPV, but they would take the OPV if it was offered to them. And so there's something about the injection of into the bloodstream, as they see it, of foreign substances as they see it, that in a small proportion of people, it generates a very visceral
Yeah.
negative reaction.
So someday we will have Band-Aid vaccine patches, and maybe that'll take care of it. We'll see if the rate goes up. But Doug, on your overall view, has it gone up in the years that you've been watching this?
Well, I think what's gone up is concern and hesitancy, and I think that's largely a reflection of the ready access to social media. I suspect that sort of the hardcore ideologic opposition to vaccination has not changed much, but those people have far greater influence than they used to. In the days of smallpox, say in the early 1900s, the only way those individuals had of getting to other people were through pamphlets that they had to distribute on the streets, which has a far lower infectivity rate than posting something on a blog or on the internet.
So how can this be addressed? How can we help educate people or counter some of the misinformation?
Well, we know that the most effective form of working with these families is a trusted healthcare provider, which is why I worry when we have a physician who's giving their patients the choice because they don't believe in herd immunity or aren't convinced it's been proven. So that's the place you have to start is with healthcare providers. But then I also think we need to be able to compete on the same platforms that people who oppose vaccinations are. So we have to get better at using social media, using blogs, using Twitter to get out important messages about vaccination and appeal to address the fears that people have in a way that resonates with them. And that, to some degree requires an understanding of what people respond to, and they frequently respond to emotional appeals more than data-based appeals.
So do we need the Kardashians saying you should be vaccinated?
Well, the truth is it helps.
Yeah.
It helps to have somebody who people know and for whatever reason trust and admire stand up and say, I vaccinated my kids. Yeah. And as it turns out, for many healthcare providers, that's the message a family wants to hear, to simply say to them, I had no hesitation vaccinating my own children. Mm-hmm. I get the flu vaccine every year, carries a really important message.
Now, you're at a medical school, so do medical students get taught that vaccines are important, or is it just assumed that they know that?
I'm sure they get it somewhere in a lecture, but it's probably one or two lectures here and there, and it's not a ever-present message.
Well, maybe based on what you're saying, this trusted relationship between the physician and the family saying this is why vaccines are important, maybe that has to be taught in medical school to do that, right?
Well, I taught medical school for nearly 40 years, and I was jumping up and down telling them about how important vaccines were.
I think you need to go back to work, get out of retirement.
No, I'm done. I'm done. So, Andrew, one of the things that we hear about now and then in this is more the anti-vax rather than the vaccine hesitancy crowd. And these terms are important because anti-vax is kind of pejorative in a way, and people back off from that. I think it's important to understand that some people really are just unsure and to be supportive of that uncertainty. And
in fact, most of them that are unsure.
So, but there is distrust of drug companies that plays into this about testing or profit motives, et cetera. So, can we reassure people about the pharmaceuticals industry's interest in vaccines?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at the things that big pharma companies, really love, it's these drugs that you take every day, like statins, for example, because that generates enormous profit for them because you take it every day, and the boomers are a large segment of the population. So, vaccines, by contrast, you get the recommendation for MMR is 2 doses. and then that's it. So, I mean, profitability-wise, I mean, the drug companies that make these products aren't doing it for charity. They do make a small profit on each shot, and I don't think we should pretend otherwise. But it's not a big profit center for pharma companies.
And the safety and efficacy, that's for independently monitored. It's not just the drug companies doing all the safety and efficacy testing, is it? I mean, so there's some sort of check on the legitimacy of claims about safety and efficacy of vaccines.
Well, ACIP, the CDC panel on immunization practices, monitors those numbers, if I'm not mistaken.
So, should vaccines be mandated?
He looks at Douglas.
Well, mandate's a tricky term, right? It's one I actually try to avoid because often what I hear people saying when they talk about school vaccine requirements is they call them mandates, and they're actually not mandates. There is no requirement that you vaccinate your child. In the strictest place, and California is one of those, right, where there is no personal belief exemption from those school entry requirements, a parent still has the choice of homeschooling their child or not sending them to the public school. So it's, in that sense, it's not really a mandate. It's not a coercive intervention. It is a requirement for school entry, and there are good reasons for that. I mean, you're about to send your child to a place where they will be surrounded by other children, some of whom are particularly vulnerable because they have diseases like cancer or immunodeficiencies and cannot be protected against these diseases that might devastate them. And so the schools have and the state has a legitimate interest in protecting school kids. And so these are really not unreasonable requirements for kids to be in school.
And is it common throughout the U.S.? Or does virtually how common are requirements for vaccination to enter schools?
So all states have a requirement that you need to be vaccinated to enter school. The difference is how easy it is to get an exemption from that requirement, or the reasons. And so 3 states, California, Mississippi, and West Virginia, will only allow you to be exempted from that requirement and go to school without the full set of vaccinations if you have a medical reason you can't get that vaccine. Most of the other states have some kind of a belief exemption that they allow, either religious or personal belief.
And the full set of vaccinations is this 14 or whatever the number is?
Well, most states don't require all 14.
Okay.
And actually there's large variation from state to state. There are still, I think, a few states that only require a handful of these, maybe 6 or 7 or 8, and others that require almost the full panel or the full panel.
So here again, it occurs to me that the personal physician is really the first line of offense, if you like, in making sure that there's good vaccine coverage.
Yeah. And I would add, from the perspective of the individual patient, that child, the school vaccine requirements don't really get you there because, from my perspective as a pediatrician, by the time they're school age, for most of these diseases, they're a lot less susceptible to really bad results. And I mean, pertussis is a great example, right? You're going to have a wicked bad cough for 2 months if you get pertussis as a 5-year-old. Probably not going to kill you. But a 2-week-old with pertussis is a nightmare. And those babies will sometimes die. And if you have a parent who waits until school age to give these vaccinations, you don't get those kids protected when they really need the protection.
And I think that's an important message we need to put out and have physicians put out is, yes, it's a personal choice whether you vaccinate your child, but that choice impacts other people's children, right? Especially the children that can't get vaccinated, and that's not fair to those other children and families.
To go back to something we talked about earlier, this very discussion is proof of that herd immunity works, because we're talking about should we mandate vaccines? Well, the reason why people don't think they need them is because herd immunity works. They're hiding in the herd.
Right.
I I mean, moms in Africa will walk for miles with their baby on their back to get a vaccine. They don't need mandates, and so it's because measles is not a theoretical concern for them, because prevalence is higher in those countries, and they can't hide in the herd. And so the challenge, I think, is to keep the herd immunity up and avoid the situation that Italy has right now with a multi-year measles epidemic that's infected 5,000 kids in Italy and has resulted in a handful of deaths. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, not having a situation where there's truly coercive, vaccination.
What's the reason for the outbreak in Italy?
There's quite a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Italy. Most of the cases are among kids who weren't vaccinated. Probably some of them were among vaccine failures, but my understanding is most of them were. There's quite a large number of unvaccinated Italian kids.
Stacey, we sort of touched on this before, but I want to get your view. How do people sort out good and bad information about vaccines that they find?
Boy, that's tough. There's a lot of both good and bad information on social media. And I think the best thing is to talk to your physician or healthcare provider, nurse, your local pharmacist, if there are questions about what is real and what is not, rather than relying on a Google search, is talk to somebody. And I think you're right in that we need to do a better job of not just hitting people with facts and statistics, because nobody wants to hear it, is really information that goes across everyone. And a lot of it will be emotional, personal stories about vaccines and vaccine failures, protection. All of those need to come out from the scientific side of things. So we need to find a more effective way of communicating with the masses why this is important beyond the statistics.
So if a parent was thinking about immunizing their child with HPV vaccine, they could go to their physician and say, well, I heard that there have been some deaths associated with this. Then that would be the right source of information. Then,
that would be one source of information, for sure. And you would hope that the response they would get would be the correct response. But I think that's still a better approach than just looking through articles on the internet.
Except for TWIV, of course.
Of course.
So you mentioned this also in your talk, I think. A lot of people feel, well, if I live a healthy lifestyle, I don't need to be vaccinated. What do we tell them?
It's great, live a healthy lifestyle, but that may not protect you if you are exposed to one of these agents. It might help you have a better response, but it is not going to protect you from the disease.
Okay. You should probably change the person on this next question.
Yeah. So, Andrew. So we dug up a bunch of, well, we didn't have to dig them up. They're right there on the surface. Myths about vaccination, okay? And we'd like to sort of take some of these one at a time.
Are we going to bust them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Mythbusters. So the big one, vaccines cause autism. Where did that come from? Just for the general public, where did that come from, and what's the status of that at this point?
So that came from a Lancet paper, an article in the medical journal Lancet that was published and has subsequently been retracted by the journal, that proposed the hypothesis that increases in autism spectrum are due to increases in measles vaccination. The logic was essentially that autism is on the rise and measles vaccination is on the rise. There's a number of flaws in this argument. I mean, first of all, this is not how we do time series analysis in in a modern setting. I mean, the price of bananas is also on the rise. Maybe that's the cause of autism. Or there are ways to design studies of phenomena that are correlated over time, and the autism measles connection, measles vaccine connection is just doesn't meet those criteria. Measles vaccination came in with the Schwartz vaccine in the U.S. in 1963, and we were only talking about autism and major increases in autism in the last 20 years or so, and so it just doesn't add up.
That scare spun off a whole bunch of other studies, did it not? That argue against, that basically debunk that whole myth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, and that's basically the reason why the Lancet retracted that paper, was that it's just been so thoroughly debunked, and that they pulled it. You want to?
Well, and I think it's worth knowing that, there were other reasons it was retracted. First of all, Wakefield had an enormous conflict of interest that he didn't disclose, which is that he was developing another vaccine for measles at the time, and stood to potentially have a lot of personal profit if he could discredit the current vaccine. But it also turns out that methodologically he did a lot of things that he didn't report in the paper that were just inappropriate. And having read, I went back and read that paper after this story all broke, and I have to admit my first reaction was this should never have been published. It's methodologically so grossly flawed that it's terrible. So, compared to the follow-up studies that have been done, these large population-based studies that have been done, they're not even on the same planet in terms of their scientific rigor.
Andrew, you made a comment in your talk about the EPI, Expanded Program for Immunization, deploying measles vaccine in many other countries, and what did
So in
tell us?
1981, measles vaccination was rolled out in many developing countries, so low-income countries at the time. And there hasn't been, the only thing that's happened is that measles has gone down. And measles mortality has fallen from 1 million kids a year around 1990 to around 100,000 or less kids a year now. Mm-hmm. And, there haven't been autism epidemics in any of those countries.
Yeah, I didn't know that, and that's an important one to keep in mind as a counter-argument. I don't know if you recently saw that there's been a new estimate of the prevalence of autism in the U.S. It went up to 1 in 59. And
well, the thing is, I think the pity about pointing at the MMR vaccine with that is that we should be studying what does cause that increase.
Sure.
And instead of arguing about measles, we should study that problem systematically.
Douglas, another myth is that too many vaccines overwhelm the immune system. Should we spread out the schedule? What are your thoughts about that?
There's no scientific basis for that. So I think the best way to think about this is that the average 2-week-old, 2-month-old, 2-year-old sees thousands of foreign antigens every day, and their immune system has to deal with those. They're coming in their mouths and it's the kid on the floor. They're coming in their mouths and their noses and through cuts, and their immune systems are dealing with those. And the vaccines we have today are so antigenically pure. This was not the case with smallpox. But they're so antigenically poor that what gets presented to a child with a vaccination is a tiny percentage of even what they're going to have to deal with that day in terms of antigenic challenges. So it's just not the case that their immune system's being overwhelmed. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what a normal, healthy immune system is doing every day.
I was always thrilled watching my children crawl around on the ground.
As was I. We had a 5-minute rule
Right.
with food on the floor.
I think part of that myth is that something we mentioned earlier about getting so many immunizations. Parents get a little queasy about that. So maybe if we could fix that, get rid of the needle or change it in some way in the future, it might be good.
And some of the vaccines, the schedule is really important, right? Like the measles vaccine.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think it really is important. I think there's a misconception that somehow the vaccine schedule has been designed for convenience or some sort of non-patient-centered reason. But the reality is that it's when those discussions are had about when to give a vaccine, it's a combination of when will it be effective. So, sometimes you can't give it too early because the immune system won't react adequately to it. But you also want to give it early enough so that the child is protected against the greatest dangers. And so when we're giving a child a vaccine at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months of age, it's because that disease would probably do more damage at that age than it would at 6 years of age. And that's the best way to protect that child. So when you delay vaccines, you lose a really important opportunity to protect your child against some really bad stuff.
So, Stacey, another myth. The vaccines contain harmful ingredients like mercury, aluminum, formaldehyde. What's the status of that?
The vaccines go through so much safety testing, and maybe many, many years ago they did have more of these preservatives, but that is not the case anymore. They're purified, they're tested, and as you can see, when they're deployed to millions of people, if they had those components in them, we would see more adverse reactions. Now, some do have a small amount of preservative, but that's to make sure you don't get a bacterial contamination in your vaccine.
So it's just the flu vaccine in this country, correct? That has.
I think there are other vaccines that probably have small amounts.
Yeah, if they're minuscule amounts.
Yeah, they're minuscule.
And so one of these is thimerosal. What's thimerosal?
It's you stumped me.
Well, I think the concern about it is that it's somehow related to aluminum.
Right.
Mercury.
Or mercury.
Right.
Yes.
But you have
mercury.
thimerosal in your contact lens solution as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thimerosal is an organomercury compound, and it's an antimicrobial, mercury-based. But as you said, less than a contact lens. It's typically used in multi-dose vials, so that
the flu vaccine, the single-dose flu vaccine, actually has had thimerosal removed.
Yeah,
it's
right.
only the multi-dose ones.
Got it.
And as I said in my talk, the MMR vaccine is a live virus vaccine, live attenuated virus vaccine. It doesn't have thimerosal and never has had thimerosal because it would kill the virus.
Mm-hmm. I seem to remember that being part of the autism argument is that mercury, and that doesn't even make sense for that, right? All right, now this came up in the question and answer before, so Douglas, I'm not sure if you or Andrew can address it, but one of the myths is that vaccines are made using aborted fetal cells.
Well, it sounded like there may be more than one aspect to why this is an issue. The one I'm familiar with is that there are some individuals with religious beliefs that have an issue with receiving a vaccine that may have been created using cell cultures from aborted fetuses. And although that is the case, and I think it's the case for the measles vaccine, those cell cultures are decades old, actually. In other words, this is not a recurring thing. These were cell cultures that originated, if I'm remembering correctly, in the 50s or 60s. And it's also my understanding that the official reading from the Catholic Church on this issue is that the connection is so remote and vaccination is so important to children that it should not pose a religious reason for objecting to vaccines.
Yeah, this is a cell, I think you mentioned this cell line earlier, WI38, is that? Is that what the vaccine is grown in? Do we know? Can you look? Hey, look it up on Google. See what we get there.
Get a reliable source, okay, for us. So another myth, if you like, that we hear about occasionally is that immunity from natural infection is better. Okay, so that we.
Well, in some ways it is. I mean, if you survive
If you survive.
Yeah, well, I'm getting there, Mike. I mean, measles elicits a very strong sterilizing immune response that lasts a lifetime. You don't get measles twice. So, if you survive natural measles infection and you don't 7 years later die from subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, then you're good for the rest of your life. It's a much stronger immune response than the measles vaccine, and we see infants born to moms who were themselves survivors of measles infection have a stronger maternal antibody than infants whose moms were vaccinated against measles. So natural infection is better at producing a long-lasting immune response. I don't think that's controversial, but do you want to take the chance that you'll die of measles? Or that you'll die of a neurodegenerative disease 7 years later? Or do you want to just get a measles jab?
And it may be worth just reminding people, because this is a good point. Most of the vaccines we have are against viruses, right? And we really don't have a good way to treat viral infections. So, if God forbid you get H. flu or meningococcus, I can at least give you an antibiotic that will hopefully save your life. But if you get measles, I can really just provide supportive care. And so it's not like there are treatments for these diseases.
But with the rise of antimicrobial resistance, this is where vaccines
more of a
against
problem.
are even more important, because we may not be able to just treat with antibiotics. So let's say you get a viral infection and then you get that secondary bacterial.
Yep.
It may be harder to treat that. And if you had been vaccinated against the virus in the first place, you might not have gotten the bacterial infection.
Yes.
All right, here's the definitive source. I have the package insert for MMR vaccine, which is what you should look at, right? It's published by Merck, who makes the vaccine. So, of course, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. Measles is propagated in chick embryo cell culture. Mumps virus is also propagated in chick embryos cell culture. And the rubella vaccine is in WI38s. Okay? So we did a TWIV with a young lady who had been, what do you want to look at that some more?
Yeah, go back. So WI38 is a human diploid lung fibroblast. So, but that was originally
I think it was fetal.
fetal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the, right. So Wakefield recently was involved in a movie called Vaxxed, which supposedly exposed all the crimes of the vaccine industry, right? And he did a press conference afterwards, and someone we know went, and she said he said outright that measles vaccine is tested in human embryos. He kind of bent the facts because people in the audience wouldn't know. And do you remember that, Nina Martin?
Yeah.
Does that. And she said if you stood up and objected, that the audience would actually boo you and silence you. So it's very scary, right? Okay, let's explore a couple of other things that you talked about today. Douglas, tell us a little bit more about the vaccine exemptions, right? You talked about school requirements for vaccination in order to go to school, but you can get around it by exemptions. Tell us more about that.
There's really three different kinds. All states allow a medical exemption, and that's supposed to only be applied for kids who truly have a reason they should not get the vaccine. They've had a prior allergic reaction, or they're allergic to eggs for some vaccines. That really, if the medical exemption rate in a state is above 1%, then people are not applying it correctly because it's a small percentage of children.
Is it above 1% in some states?
Yes, it is, and that's particularly true in a state like California, where there's no other way to get out of the vaccine requirement. And so what you have is, unfortunately, some physicians bending the rules a little bit and just saying that a child has a medical contraindication when they really don't. The other two kinds of exemptions are, some states have a more restrictive religious exemption where you need a valid religious reason to get out of the vaccine. The interesting thing is that it's hard to identify an organized religion that actually has an objection to vaccination. So that should be a pretty small percentage of people. And then about half the states have a personal belief exemption, which is just a way of broadening that to include pretty much any objection that a family has, because almost any objection can be couched as a personal belief objection.
Now, there have been some measles outbreaks in religious communities, right? Because the leaders have said this vaccine is not good, and people listen. So but that's not a valid religious objection.
Well, the difficult part about the religious exemption is who gets to decide whether it's valid, and most states are very reluctant, I think rightfully so, to wade into that terrain. So the truth is that most states that have a religious exemption, in practical terms, that expands to a personal belief exemption in terms of the way it's applied.
Now, you expressed an opinion in your talk about where we should be going in terms of exemptions. Would you like to tell us that?
Well, I think the first approach, before we eliminate the non-medical exemptions, I think the first approach is you just make it harder to get an exemption. And I think there are reasonable ways to do that. I mean, so my personal philosophy is it ought to be as hard to get an exemption as it is to get your child vaccinated. And that's no easy task. It's a lot of visits to the doctor. And so at a minimum, I think to get an exemption, there should be a visit to a healthcare provider. There should be an educational session. And in my mind, that should maybe be annually.
So the Wakefield incident seems to persist. It doesn't seem to be, or is it going away? And he certainly keeps pounding on this. What motivates a person like him to continue in promulgating something that has been proven wrong, and what is it that allows this to persist? Do we have any feeling for this?
Well, as far as what motivates him, you should ask him. I mean, I don't know. I mean, as we discussed during the panel that preceded this podcast, there have been waves of anti-vaccine sentiment, ever since Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine in the late 18th century. And right now we're sort of riding the crest of a wave against it. And we did see after the Disneyland measles outbreak a increase in vaccination, and so I do think that this theme that it's a symptom of vaccine zone success that we have all these anti-vax because it's so easy to hide in the herd, and that people see when what can happen when you don't vaccinate, that you can get this really some pretty bad illnesses. So I mean I think these things do come in cycles, and we probably will see a diminution, but you're right that it seems to be kind of durable right now, a durable sentiment, and I'm not exactly sure why.
The Disney incident actually reinforces this idea that personal experience is more effective than a bunch of numbers and statistics in terms of convincing people about the importance of this.
So, Stacey, you showed a slide about what happened in California after the measles outbreak. Can you share that with us?
Sure. There's a wonderful series of maps showing the number of children going into kindergarten with exemptions for vaccination. And it was continuing to increase from 2000, 2003, 2007, all the way up until about 2014. And then when you look at the map, 2015, 2016, 2017, you see more children. It's actually increasing the number of children that are getting vaccinated, not getting these exemptions. And I think it definitely has to do to personal experience. The measles outbreak, the rise in whooping cough that occurred in California. It's people being reminded that these diseases are still out there and they can devastate your children.
In fact, Douglas, you said we should take more advantage of outbreaks, right?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, I think, sometimes they're happening and the media doesn't cover them. And, those of us in the medical profession who are taking care of these kids, every year we have, at most pediatric hospitals, there's at least one, if not more than one, child who dies of the influenza. And yet the community rarely hears about that. And
Right.
those personal stories, I think, are really important.
And they just think it's just flu. It's
Exactly.
no big deal. And I tell
Yes.
people, especially about the rotavirus vaccine, my older son in kindergarten ended up in pediatric intensive care for a week, lost 20% of his body weight in about 3 days from rotavirus. And had that vaccine been available, definitely would have gotten, because it was devastating to watch him. He was unconscious for days from dehydration.
So, Stacy, just flu.
Just
in,
flu.
In air quotes. What are the statistics on flu in the U.S. in terms of morbidity and mortality?
So just flu kills 25 to 40,000 people each year in the U.S. alone, and that's not even a year like we had this past year. This is a normal year that we don't even reach epidemic levels. And again, you think about it being the very young, the very old, but it's pregnant women, it's children, it's overweight and obese people, people with underlying medical conditions. So this happens every year, but you still hear people saying, well, it's just flu, including study section members.
Is that the primary reason that the flu vaccine is such a hard sell, or are there other reasons as well?
I think that's one reason, is it's just flu, and perhaps people have not been exposed to somebody that has severe influenza infection. The press about the vaccine efficacy in recent years. It's important to be transparent about the issues with the vaccine, but you have to be also correct in the message that you're sending. And this past year, saying that the vaccine was only 10% effective, that was one component of a 4-component vaccine. And that was never made clear in the media, and I don't think by public health officials, and maybe even by healthcare professionals, is somebody would come in and say, the flu shot doesn't work this year. Yeah, it doesn't. Yes, it does, because when these other strains start circulating, you're going to be protected against those.
Stacey, I heard on a podcast that's very same discussion. These two guys who are tech guys, they were saying, the flu vaccine doesn't work this year. So I wrote in and I said, it's one strain out of 4, and you'll still get less serious disease, so you really should get it. And you know what? They read my email and they said, he must work for Big Pharma.
Right, right. And I had a lot of people, colleagues at work, saying, flu vaccine doesn't work this year, I still got the flu. And I'm like, well, you're still alive. So, and influenza vaccine, like we heard before, Big Pharma, vaccines are not big money producers. It's not Viagra, right? They make them, a lot of times it's governments, it's WHO purchasing these, cents on the dollar. These are not big money makers for pharma.
So maybe you could, a lot of people probably don't understand why the flu vaccine is given every year, and the concept of a universal flu vaccine. Could you do that for us?
Sure. So the flu vaccine is given every year. One is to make sure that if you do have some waning immunity, that you continue to be protected, but also because the virus can change so quickly as it goes through populations. It tends to drift. So it changes some of its components that can make it look very different when you get infected from it. And so we have to make sure that the vaccine keeps up with the virus. The concept of a universal vaccine, and if we start with what our mandate is for the next 3 to 5 years, is to create a vaccine that protects against all of the different variants or strains of just even H3, which is what went through the population this year, and we saw how devastating that was, is can we create a vaccine that will give us the breadth to protect against any H3 that was to come out? And once we've created that, can we now extend it to protect against all of the human seasonal influenza strains that we know about? Not necessarily the Bs, but all of the As, the H1s and the H3s. And it's got to protect you against reduced disease by 75%. It's got to be safe, and it's got to have long-lasting immunity. So maybe you won't have to get that vaccine every year. Those are our marching orders.
Yeah, those are pretty tall orders, right?
They are, but I think it's possible. There's a lot of new technology in the future. Some of the things we've talked about earlier is including some of the internal components of the virus rather than just sort of what you see on the surface, because then you will mount a broader immune response that even if that surface, if the virus changes its hair color, it's still got the guts that it needs in order to protect you against it.
So someday we'll have such a vaccine, right?
Absolutely.
And do you think that will help on the uptake of flu vaccination?
I don't know. I think that is something that we really need to consider is even if we make the best possible vaccine, if we still have low uptake, it's going to be a problem. So that's something we have to work on is protecting, getting that herd immunity, especially for the populations that even with the broadest vaccine, we may still have problems protecting some of our target populations. And so we need to get that herd immunity.
But the idea would be that you would get it maybe once every 10 years, right?
That would be the
That
goal.
would help,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. Or even once every few years rather
Yeah.
than a yearly vaccine.
What is the current uptake on flu vaccine in the U.S.?
I think this year was not very good. In the past, if we've hit 50 to 70%, it was fantastic. This year was much lower. And if you look around the world, it's even lower than that. And it's important, especially to get your children vaccinated because they're more likely to have severe disease. They also shed a lot more virus for a longer amount of time, so they're more likely to spread within the community.
Is the uptake of the vaccine any better in a pandemic year where there's so much press about it?
Yes, so during the 2009 pandemic, I think a lot of that is fear, is that more people did get the vaccine because they were afraid of what that virus, because this is the 100-year anniversary of 1918. So it's a perfect time to think about the flu vaccine. Could something like 1918 happen again? I think it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we will have another pandemic. Will it be as severe as in 1918? I would doubt it because of antibiotics, because of vaccines being able to create them, because we were able to create the 2009 pandemic vaccine fairly quickly. So we would hope we'd never see the morbidity and mortality that was associated with 1918 in modern times.
So you did a poll of the audience during your talk. Let's see again. How many got the flu vaccine this year? So this is not the usual, right?
No, this is fantastic, and it made me wonder, is it something that's strongly suggested, we won't say mandated, by the university?
No?
No.
Well, medical school, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
medical school you have
right.
to. We have to be able to walk through the medical buildings.
And we have to as well.
Otherwise, you have to wear a mask. And I don't want to do that, but I love getting the flu vaccine. There's nothing like getting an injection, right?
Well, maybe you'll get a Band-Aid someday.
Actually, one point that I think you made, Doug, in your talk is the accessibility of vaccination is really important. For me, I used to, when I was a working stiff, I used to, on the way to the cafeteria at a certain season of the year, they would have tables set up to offer flu vaccination for all of the employees. Now I gotta, make an effort to go out and get my vaccination. So what cost and ease of getting a vaccination is gonna make a huge difference, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I wish we could move vaccination back into the schools because I think that would increase our rate.
Actually, this reminds me, there was are you aware of this? There was a program in Gainesville at the University of Florida. You're familiar with this,
Yep,
Stacey?
I am,
Parker
yeah.
Small was involved in
Right,
this,
right.
where they, tell us about that program.
So they were going in. It was part of, I think, your emerging path. It was a
Yeah.
group that had gotten state funding to go in and vaccinate in the schools. And I think they were using flu mist.
Yes,
so
they
they
were
would go
using
in
flu mist.
and they would administer flu mist, and the uptake was it was close to 100%. And the incident of disease, when you watched it epidemiologically, went down in the community.
In the community.
In the
so this is
community.
a good argument for
Herd immunity.
herd immunity.
Absolutely.
It seems to me that it's pretty easy to get a flu vaccine. I mean, every drugstore I walk
Right.
by, there's always a sign, $6 for flu vaccine. So what about if the government bought all the doses and gave them away? How much would that cost the U.S. government, do you know, roughly? Be less than $1 billion?
It would definitely be less than $1 billion.
And then gave it away for free. Would that help? Or
I don't know, because all countries buy a certain amount of flu vaccines. Some of them get them through WHO. And it's often that these countries will turn in unused portions or unused stock. So, but I think it's ironic that people can't go in and spend $6 to get a flu vaccine, but boy, you tell them that they can come get a vitamin B12 shot in their rear end for $30 and they're going to lose 15 pounds from that. They are in line around the corner.
So vaccines cause weight loss, right? That's what we
Maybe that's what you can tell you.
well, on that note, that has been. Anything else from you? You okay?
I'm cool.
TWIV 496. You can find TWIV at any of your programs that you use on your phone or your tablet where you listen to podcasts. Just search for TWIV and subscribe. Get every episode for free and listen. And if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to us at twiv@microbe.tv. If you like what we do, consider supporting us. We do have costs, and we like to travel and do shows on the road. So you can go to microbe.tv/contribute, and you could do like $1 a month, and that would really help. If all our listeners did that, we could really do cool things. I'd like to thank our guests today from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, Stacy Schultz-Cherry. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
From the University of Washington, Doug Diekema. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
And from University of California, Irvine, Andrew Noymer. Thank you.
Thank you. And you can follow me on Twitter at Andrew Noymer, or you can block me on Twitter at Andrew Noymer.
And Andrew Noymer. Very good. Douglas, you have a Twitter account?
Not really.
Stacy?
ASV Prez. right
ASV
now.
Prez, the real ASV Prez. No, just ASV Prez. Rich Condit, my co-host today, is an emeritus professor at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He's currently residing in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough, always a good time.
I want to thank the UCI Center for Virus Research, the Sue and Bill Gross Stem Cell Research Center for supporting this meeting and this episode of TWIV. And I want to thank Bert Semler, Sid Golub, and Crystal Spitale for their help, for inviting us, and for organizing. Thank you so much. I want to thank Ray Ortega, our producer, and the American Society for Microbiology, of which he is an employee, for allowing him to come here and do this, help us out with the video and audio today. And I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. In closing, to paraphrase Neil deGrasse Tyson, the good thing about vaccines is that they work whether or not you believe in them. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWIV is viral.